Today is July 20th, 2023. We are here in the North Carolina State Park at the Great Dismal Swamp. It is just before 10 o'clock in the morning. My name is Donovan Carter with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida, and I'm joined by...
I'm Eric Sheppard.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sheppard, for joining us today. Can you spell your name for us for the record, please?
Yes, Eric, E-R-I-C, Sheppard, S-H-E-P-P-A-R-D.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Sheppard. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are and where you're from?
Yes, I was born and raised in Baltimore City, and about 20 some odd years ago, I decided to start tracing my family tree. And I had done a lot on the Sheppard side, and my grandfather married a Grandy, last name Grandy, my grandmother, Elnora Grandy. And I had never come down to this area of Virginia and North Carolina before until I started tracing my roots. And from that experience over 20 years now, when I first came down here and went into Chesapeake, Virginia, I met my father's first cousin, and he informed me that the family really came out of Camden, North Carolina. Came down here for the very first time, and as we do, we find out the church community and the cemetery of where everybody might be buried to get information. And I went to the church one Sunday, and we have this, it's a routine in the African-American church where they'll say, "All visitors, please stand." I stood up, told them why I was there. While I was about to leave the church, somebody came up to me and said, well, you know, your people are buried out there. And I went around there, and sure enough, my great-great-grandfather's headstone was there. His name was Edmund Grandy. He was born in 1827, died in 1906. And that story led to this whole discovery of our Grandy family ancestor, Moses Grandy, who was born here in Camden County in around 1786.
Wow.
And in 1843, his story was told and published in a slave narrative, which I found, not that I had no clue about the slave narrative when I was down here. That came, we say by accident, but nothing's by accident. It's a place nearby called Grandy, North Carolina. And I thought maybe there would be some family history in that part of North Carolina. And when I got home back to Baltimore, I did a Google search for Grandy, North Carolina, and up pops the life of Moses Grandy, late a slave in the United States of America. And once I had uncovered that information, I became what I call a genealogy detective. I used the clues in that slave narrative, and everywhere Moses went from that slave narrative, I went and found other Grandy relatives living there. So we all came together in 2003 in Chesapeake, Virginia. We organized the first Grandy family reunion to that magnitude, and 140 of us came together for the very first time, and I would say 85% of us did not know each other. It was all based on the clues left in that slave narrative.
Wow.
So that's been quite a journey. Moses Grandy was enslaved down here. He bought his freedom. It took him 3 times to do so. And once he bought his freedom, he had to go in a residence in a northern state for a year, and that was Providence, Rhode Island, which I found some other relatives there. And just before he had the slave narrative written about his life, he was living in Boston, Massachusetts, and he was working in Portland, Maine as a waterman. And he went over to London, England, where
wow.
they documented his story. It was an organization called the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society. And I went over to London, England. Their organization still exists to this day, and it's called Anti-Slavery International now. And so as a detective, looking into some of the clues that Moses Grandy left us, here we are today. We have information about the Great Dismal Swamp, and now which is part of the Underground Railroad Network, the Freedom Program. And so you put all the pieces of the puzzle together, and you find out, from my perspective, the history of what happened in this area. If you have an opportunity to read the slave narrative, it would make for a great, I'm gonna do a little plug, feature film of what happened down here in Virginia, North Carolina area, the Great Dismal Swamp being an underground railroad destination for people who were enslaved. They gathered here and came through here and got their way up, or found their way up north through the Underground Railroad, I think by the waterways more so. And if I had time to really take you on this tour, I would show you how the detective put some evidence together and how this more than likely happened for many of them that were trying to find their way to freedom. And the waterways with the Great Dismal Swamp is a major key in the story, because at that time, back in the early 1800s, there was a gentleman named Moses Myers, who was the Dismal Swamp Canal Company president. So the digging of the swamp, the canal, getting the timber out to build houses and those type of things that were needed back in the early 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s. And he was the president of the canal company, but he also owned 5 ships. And those 5 ships, I believe, were part of the Underground Railroad activity going north.
Wow.
And he actually went bankrupt, Moses Myers did. And one of the options that was given to him was to get involved with the slave trade so that he could save his company, and he refused. See, so it's not just a black and white picture that we're trying to paint. Everybody helped from different ethnic groups along the Underground Railroad, and we should give credit to where credit is due.
Absolutely.
So I know that was a long...
No, that's amazing. Thank you for that.
Oh, sure. So I became more so involved after finding out about this story and my ancestry being involved. Then you see how 20 years ago, the fruits of the labor of our enslaved ancestors were given no recognition of their contribution. And so that became a part of my mission to do that and to make sure that Moses Grandy and others that were enslaved get their proper due in the African American community especially, but also to be recognized globally for their persistence to endure slavery in America, and they survived long enough for us to be here today. So that's remarkable in itself.
Yes, absolutely. I want to ask, so you say you kind of became more interested in the early 2000s about your family history. What led to that interest? Could you pinpoint something that led to that interest?
Oh, absolutely. I was in 1995, April 1995, I was one of 3 gentlemen that met in Baltimore to plan the Million Man March. So there was 2 gentlemen, 2 giants in their own right, that met at a restaurant. I was just there to go along with Reverend Dr. John Wright, I used to attend his church years ago, and we were just meeting for breakfast or something. He said, "Oh, come on down to this restaurant with me. Ben Chavis wants to talk about something Minister Farrakhan is doing about some march or something." So I rode along. And when the three of us were at the restaurant, and they were going over the Million Man March and what the vision was, I'm sitting there listening. And after that meeting, of course, Ben Chavis went on to other cities, and Reverend Dr. Wright and myself talked about it, and he was, at that time, the president of the NAACP for the state of Maryland. He was also the president of the Baptist Convention here for the state of Maryland. So I'm looking at these two giants, and then there's me, a former government employee that started my small business, and here I'm at the table. And so I said to myself, I understand why those two are involved, but then I had to dig deeper spiritually. Well, why are you there? And what kind of role are you to play? And what they did, they assigned me the role of outreach chair for the Million Man March. I had no clue. What I was doing was not an activist, not in those larger organizations or connected with them, especially in some of the cultural or Afrocentric community. So I was a little green from that perspective, but we did what we needed to do, and other people started to come on slowly, and it built up and everything. And actually, about a month or two before the march was actually conducted in Washington, D.C., people started to really gravitate towards, you've seen the momentum and you've seen the build up. And then it came to play, you know, and you might want to edit that a little bit, but then it came out that as all these organizations started to come in, and some of the people who were more recognized in large organizations and the like, and who were known in those circles, then I could tell instinctively that I needed to, as a result of the feeling I got from some of them looking at me, to be honest with you, is it, well, who is he? And he doesn't measure up to what they're doing. Well, okay. And I started to feel like, wow, who am I? And then, to me, divinely inspired, I had a thought that came to me and said, don't worry about the march. What I have you for is after the march. My spirit calmed down. I was good to go. The march went off. Everything was good. And I say, well, see, I must find out who I am. And that led me to start doing genealogy research. Who knew that I would find the Moses Grandy story, and then everything just takes shape and take direction. And so now, having the foundation of an ancestor who was enslaved opened the doors for me in Africa. And I go into Africa, took that slave narrative with me when I went there, and we made some solid connections in Africa, which led to the the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge being a strategic tourism partner with the Barotse Kingdom in Western Province, Zambia.
Wow.
So that's one of the results of this. And because that kingdom apologized to me when I got there, I was the first African American to come to that kingdom by themselves. I was traveling by myself on that particular journey in 2017. The king granted me 300 acres of land in the kingdom to build a homecoming headquarters for African Americans and others that want to connect to the African continent to heal and to provide hope for the future. And that little meeting before the Million Man March with those two giants and myself, I understand now why I was there, regardless of what anybody say. You know, you will know them by the fruit that they bear. We bear fruit, not me personally, but evidently there's a certain energy around what we do and what's happening here at the Great Dismal Swamp that needs to be shared with the world.
Absolutely. So I want to ask one more question before we kind of transition.
Yeah.
So you're talking about a story that spans centuries, over 100 years.
Yeah.
Or I guess two questions. First, how far away is Moses Grandy from you? Do you know how many generations, or could you guess?
Well, I would say this, because a lot of things were not recorded in those days, and a lot of things were not designed for us to find out about. But the clues that he left in the slave narrative and the dates. My great-great-grandfather was born in 1827 in Camden County, North Carolina. Many people don't know this, but Moses Grandy's son, that's recorded in the slave narrative, you had to be a detective to dig, to find out the name and some other information. He was also born in 1827. But I believe, because Moses Grandy, he identified who his children were and how they were sold to different places in the United States. He did not mention my great-great-grandfather, so I believe my great-great-grandfather, Edmund Grandy, was Moses Grandy's nephew. Based on the dates, based on what I perceive as the way things were at that time. Now, I'm not going to say that Moses Grandy was my great-great-grandfather's father, but evidently Moses Grandy had another child at the same time. So they're all, at the least, cousins, nephew. Something along those lines. And Moses Grandy did mention his siblings, which were in the area, and one was named Benjamin, and Benjamin may, even though I don't have the records, been my great-great-great-grandfather and brother of Moses Grandy.
Wow.
Yeah.
How do I put this? Okay. I want to go back on Africa. This is going to be my last question for now.
Yeah.
So, what ways have you talked to your own family about the story and the narrative and the history of that?
Oh, yeah. I've shared it with family on the Grandy Sheppard side of the family, as well as my mother's side, the King Flood side of the family. So they're starting to learn more and more about it. There are, in families, this is just totally my observation, all of us come from families, but we got that one or two family members that do the genealogy research, that's in charge of the reunions, and not everybody gets that divine assignment to do that for their family. And everybody has, their own life. Now, everybody's not meant to do the same thing. So they know about it, they research, and there's a certain amount of pride. That's why they all came down in 2003, 140 of us, from around the country. And they all find their avenue of where it fits, but at least they know about it. I believe they've done, some of the younger children at that time were in school, and they had projects around Moses Grandy as well. And so they know. And but that's just the tip of the iceberg. Not all family members know. And then so when you start to think about second, third, fourth, fifth cousins on one side, and then there's my mother's side as well that's a part of this story as well in their history. So it's time for us to gather up at this point, using the history that we can find, connecting with people regardless of their ethnic background to help put the pieces of the puzzle together. And once you do that, there's nothing you can do to change that history. So you might as well find ways to make things better now and for the future. And so that's what I encourage and promote here and in Africa to do that. Yeah.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much. We're going to continue this conversation a bit later.
Okay.
At Lake
Drummond.
At Lake Drummond,
Yes.
on the Virginia side.
Right.
So thank you so much. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you. Okay, well, again, introduce myself. I'm Eric Sheppard, and now we're at Lake Drummond at the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge in Suffolk, Virginia, and we just dedicated and named this pier, Reflection Pier, to honor the ancestors and freedom supporters that helped our ancestors during their freedom struggle hundreds of years ago. So this is where we are. And this is Mr. Chris Lowie. He's the refuge manager here in the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge.
Yes, thank you both for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yes. And can you talk about what it was like to get the plaque placed and what that process was like?
Well, that came from a request from Eric to do something to commemorate this area. And, our role with the National Wildlife Refuge System is to do as much education, outreach, and community engagement as we can to share the information. That's all we can do from what we know from narratives, research, and what we learn. How can we help tell that story to educate the people? So for me, it was a no-brainer, and we just spent some time coming up with the right language, to be inclusive, and just let people know what this area meant to the history of the United States in this area.
Absolutely. So, Mr. Sheppard, I kind of want to return to what we were talking a little bit about earlier. You mentioned how you had, or as you learned more of the story of your ancestor, Moses Grandy, you learned, you also became hopeful for the future. Can you talk about perhaps what you hope for and what you wish to accomplish?
Yeah, well, I'm hoping for a dramatic change in the visibility given to the history of enslaved people in America, and more in particular to the Great Dismal Swamp and this history around here, because it was a major underground railroad stop along the way. And they have estimates of 50,000 people coming through here. Of course, the Maroons set up communities and lived here and were free, but then a lot of others came through here on the way to free states. So we want that visibility to be shared, or the history and given visibility to be shared around the world. But also part of the future is connecting, as we have done with the Great Dismal Swamp. We have a strategic tourism partner with the Barotse Kingdom in Zambia that now will share their history with us here at the Great Dismal Swamp, and we will share the story here with the African continent, so it starts to connect up and come together. Wow. So that's part of the future.
That's amazing. Yeah. And another question I ask is, as we're out here, we're looking out at this incredible vast expanse of water, and we see the tree line way in the distance. We're here on Reflection Pier, so when you guys are here, what do you guys reflect and think about?
Oh, Chris, you want to take that one first?
Well, I mean, for me in my career like this, I grew up, I'm an aquatic biologist by training, so I love the water. But to be out here just gives me a different feeling of, we call this lake the heart of the swamp. It is in the center of the Dismal Swamp, and so it's just so peaceful. And you know, for me to come out here today, it gets me away from my desk, away from my computer, and I can reflect and think, what am I doing for this landscape? What am I doing for the people, my constituents here, and for the wildlife that are here? And so it does give me an opportunity to pause,
Yeah.
you know, and think.
Yes. And for me, it has already paid dividends, actually, coming out here, finding out about the history. But there's a certain energy out here that we've seen and witnessed. What the energy, the peacefulness, a certain kind of energy out here that gives people hope for the future. One example, I had a gentleman that contacted me and brought some formerly incarcerated individuals here to the Great Dismal Swamp, and he was visiting other Underground Railroad sites. But what they did when they came here, he put a chair right there and had each one of them reflect on what they had done and how they are hoping for better things in the future. And I got one of the finest compliments I could ever get from an individual who happened to have been incarcerated on a murder charge. And he came here, a young man, I'm thinking in his 30s, got out of prison, was on parole, and had to get permission to leave the state to come here, his state. And he said, Mr. Sheppard, you know, if I had met you years ago, I probably wouldn't have done what I did. And it wasn't me. It was the energy out here and the history associated made him reflect. But yet, that's a young man who I think was from New Orleans. I think he will always remember the Dismal Swamp and maybe even come here and hopefully bring some of his network of people here to visit. So it's already paying dividends as far as I'm concerned.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I want to circle back to more about the connection you've brought from Zambia. Can you talk a little more about that and kind of how that came to be?
Well, that came to be in going around to different African countries that I've been blessed to be able to do so since 2006. And got an invitation to go to Zambia, knew nothing about that country and the slave trade history associated with it. That was the only reason I would go to a country if they had history of the slave trade coming through, and they're right next to Angola. See, everybody always thinks Angola, but our people came from somewhere in the interior as well. And so Zambia borders Angola, and the kingdom at the far western end of Zambia welcomed me there. I was traveling alone at the time. Welcomed me there with open arms, and a lot of the people came out. And they took me to what they called the slave pen there, and showed me and informed me about how the Arab slave traders came and they held people there. The water hole is still there, and they would bathe and water the captives, give them water and bathe them. And at that particular site, they apologized for their participation in the slave trade and hoped for a brighter future. And that's when I came back and connected the Great Dismal Swamp here with the refuge manager, Chris, to establish a strategic partnership with them to share history and hopefully to share visits in the future.
Yes, that's amazing. I actually don't know if I have more questions. Sherry, anything? Miss Sherry?
Well, maybe we can give Chris Chris, about a minute or so to
Sure.
have people think about coming here and visiting, and some of the attractions, if you will, that you offer here at the swamp, a little bit of the history.
Yeah, sure. So we, the Great Dismal Swamp Wildlife Refuge, just a remnant of what the larger swamp was. It used to be 1 million acres in size. We offer a lot of visitor opportunities, something for everybody, from birders to history buffs, archaeologists. Where we came out here to Lake Drummond is our auto tour route, so people can drive right out here. It's a 6-mile drive. And along the way, there is a boardwalk that'll take you to our Underground Railroad Education Pavilion. It's just a pavilion to host programs, and there's some interpretive panels that describe what we know from a lot of archaeological research that was done over 13 years. And then there's some boardwalks that walk you through some habitat areas, and it brings you out here to the heart of the swamp, to this beautiful lake and Reflection Pier, where, again, I like how you said the energy, if it's tied back in.
Yes.
It's a quiet energy. It just hangs right here of to just be out here and think about how this landscape shaped America, and from the freedom seekers that came through, the maroon colonies, the lumber companies that, harvested all the timber off of here, and the slave labor that assisted with all that. It's just, and, in closing, I would say that what I always say, this place is a refuge for wildlife, and it's a refuge for people, and it always has been, and it always will be.
Wow.
Which is great.
Yeah, it's a great thing. Yeah, and I'd just like to add that looking at the future and having the Great Dismal Swamp and the history associated with enslavement actually now turn around hundreds of years later and be a beacon for the future for freedom that connects our history with the African continent in a mighty way. I think it's great, and it also lends to the new energy of getting descendants more involved and participate more, as well as the scholars.
Absolutely. So, last question for you, Chris. What type of, fish and birds are most common out here in the swamp?
In the lake, the fish populations are primarily catfish, bullhead, yellow perch. The unique fish are the gar and the bowfin. Those are really almost prehistoric type fish, very low on the evolutionary change of fish, again, as my aquatic biology experience tells me. And so, we get fishermen that come out here and fish. And then as far as wildlife, it's primarily white-tailed deer, wild turkey, bobcat. But we do have the largest density of black bear in the state of Virginia here for black bear. So that's a wonderful sighting. And then, of course, many species of reptiles and amphibians.
Right. And I think we saw at least a few hawks coming. Was that right?
Yeah, I did see some. Yeah, hawks and vultures.
Right.
Yeah, herons. You'll see herons, or some ducks will fly out of the ditches as you're driving along the roads. And of course, I have to mention really the what are called neotropical migratory birds. The bird watchers. In the spring and fall, we've got a lot of public that comes here just to observe the bird migration through here.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And what would you want to talk with Moses Grundy about if you had a chance to talk with him?
Well, the first question I'll ask as the genealogy detective from his slave narrative, he mentioned that he was originally down in Deep Creek area of Virginia and Camden County, North Carolina, but when he camped out for a year because he gotten sick and he needed about a year to heal up, he said he was on the other side of Lake Drummond. I wonder if this was the side he was on, right here in Suffolk, where, now there's a pier, there's a road, and what have you, but that would be interesting to know. Secondly, I would tell him that his efforts did not go in vain. he left a legacy, and we're following through with what he started by just sharing his story, but also surviving enslavement here. And what I would want to know from him actually is, and he probably couldn't describe it, but he had to purchase his freedom 3 times. And he was very distraught over that, as anybody would be. What gave him the drive to keep going? And he was brutalized to some degree from whippings and things of that nature. And he had to endure and keep hope going. And I could tell by some of the writings at the end of his slave narrative that he was a spiritual person. So I would like to ask him, well, where did that come from? Because it doesn't necessarily mean that you were in a building or going to weekly services. But was there something a little deeper that he would like to share? So those are some of the leading questions that I would have to ask.
That's amazing. Well, thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you
Yes.
again.
Thank you.
All right. Good.
Great.
All right.
Good
That was
to you.
wonderful.
Pathway to Freedom, the Underground Railroad, and the Great Dismal Swamp. Slavery was a widespread practice in the region from the time the colonists first settled here. From the earliest times, some enslaved people attempted to escape their bondage. The Great Dismal Swamp provided a number of these freedom seekers a place of rest and refuge. Some made homes deep in the swamp where they lived in communities known as maroon colonies. Others used the swamp as a temporary hiding place on their journey to freedom. Slaves did most of the work in the building of the Dismal Swamp Canal. They also did a great deal of work in the shingle making and timbering in the swamp. Working in the swamp helped them become familiar with it and provided them with the chance to escape into it. During the early 1800s, so many slaves fled into the Great Dismal that slave owners in the area became angry. They asked North Carolina General Assembly to draft a bill specifically to help them catch slaves that escaped into the swamp. Sometime around 1830s, the term Underground Railroad came into use. It referred to the loose network of people and places helping fugitives escape to freedom. The slaves seeking freedom were at constant risk of recapture, and those helping them were breaking the law. For those reasons, secrecy was of the utmost importance. As a result, many of the stories of the journeys to freedom have been lost to us. The National Park Service recognizes the Great Dismal Swamp and the Dismal Swamp Canal as sites of its National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom program.